Welcome back to Stamps U.S., Exploring History. Today, we're diving into the rarest treasures. Don't forget to subscribe.
Welcome back to Stamps U.S., where every old stamp has a story. And sometimes that tiny piece of paper can be worth far more than anyone would expect. Today, we are looking at 3 fascinating vintage U.S. stamps from different eras. Stamps featuring Benjamin Franklin, the historic signing of the Declaration of Independence, and the legendary Curtis Jenny airplane. Some examples from these issues have achieved thousands, tens of thousands, and even extraordinary 6- and 7-figure prices when rare varieties, errors, exceptional condition, and authentication come into play. So, before you overlook an old stamp sitting inside a forgotten album or collection, take a closer look. One tiny detail could completely change its story and potentially its value. Let's begin with our first stamp. Imagine finding an old blue postage stamp in a forgotten collection and discovering that it dates back to 1861, a period when America was entering one of the most turbulent chapters in its history. The stamp shown here is the classic 1-cent blue Benjamin Franklin, associated with the 1861 U.S. issue and identified as Scott 63. At first glance, it may look like an ordinary old stamp, but this tiny piece of paper carries more than 160 years of American postal history, and depending on its condition, shade, cancellation, provenance, or unusual printing characteristics, examples of this issue have brought surprisingly strong prices at auction. The portrait immediately catches your attention. Benjamin Franklin appears in profile at the center, surrounded by an intricate blue engraved background and ornate lettering. Franklin was not chosen randomly. He was one of the most important figures in early American history and had a deep connection with the development of the American postal system. His appearance on U.S. postage made perfect historical sense, and the 1-cent denomination was particularly important because it served everyday postal needs. When this issue appeared in 1861, the United States was undergoing enormous political and social change, making surviving examples fascinating historical artifacts as well as collectible stamps. But here's where the story becomes much more interesting for collectors. Scott 63 is not simply valuable because it is old. Thousands of old stamps exist, and age alone does not automatically make a stamp expensive. What collectors look for is a combination of rarity, condition, color, centering, gum, cancellation, printing characteristics, and provenance. A beautifully centered example with strong original color can be dramatically more desirable than a damaged example of exactly the same issue. Auction records demonstrate just how different the market can become when an ordinary-looking stamp possesses something special. One documented auction example of the 1861 1-cent blue with exceptional centering, rich color, and original gum sold for $1,500. While another extremely well-centered example with outstanding condition sold for around $1,200, and then there are the truly unusual examples. One 1861 1-cent blue with a remarkable early Baltimore cancellation associated with the earliest recorded usage was offered with an estimate of $2,000 to $3,000 and ultimately sold for an astonishing $12,000. That is the kind of story that makes collectors stop and look twice at apparently ordinary old stamps. Even more dramatic are major printing varieties. One extraordinary Scott 63 printed on both sides was described as a spectacular and extremely rare printing variety, with a Scott value of $50,000 at the time of the cited auction. That particular example sold for $16,000. So if you have an old 1-cent Franklin, don't immediately assume it is a fortune, but don't throw it away either. Look closely at the shade of blue. Examine the perforations. Check the centering. Study the cancellation. Look for unusual paper characteristics, printing varieties, plate markings, or other features that could separate an ordinary example from a scarce one. Most importantly, don't attempt to clean, flatten, repair, or alter the stamp. A collector or professional expert may find details that are impossible to recognize with the naked eye, and that's what makes this little blue Franklin so fascinating. Its face value was only 1 cent, but exceptional examples have crossed into the thousands and even reached 5-figure auction results. A stamp that once paid for an ordinary piece of mail can now tell the story of 19th century America, and in the right condition or variety, it can become a serious collectible. Next up, let's move to a stamp that looks completely different and potentially becomes even more interesting when you start examining its history. The stamp shown here is the 1869 24-cent green and violet pictorial, commonly identified as Scott 120, featuring the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This stamp is part of the famous 1869 pictorial issue, a groundbreaking series in American philately. The design combines a green frame with a violet central image, creating one of the most distinctive appearances of 19th century U.S. postage. The first thing that makes this stamp special is its age. We are talking about a stamp issued in 1869, more than 150 years ago. But its importance isn't based simply on its age. The 1869 pictorial issue introduced innovative designs that were very different from the conventional portrait-based postage Americans were accustomed to seeing. The 24-cent denomination was a high-value stamp for its era and was used for significant postage requirements, including international mail. Look closely at the stamp in the image. The green border surrounds a darker central scene representing the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The engraving is incredibly detailed, especially when you remember that this image was produced using 19th century printing technology. Every line, frame element, and tiny detail represents craftsmanship from an era long before modern digital printing, and this is where the value story becomes serious. A normal used example of Scott 120 can be worth hundreds of dollars, depending on condition and characteristics, while high-quality examples with original gum and exceptional condition have sold for several $1,000s. Documented auction results include examples selling for $4,250, $4,750, $5,750, and even $6,250 depending on condition, centering, gum, color, and other characteristics. But there is an incredible secret associated with this stamp. Collectors know that the 1869 24-cent pictorial exists with an inverted center variety, cataloged as Scott 120B. Instead of the central image appearing in its normal orientation, the central vignette is inverted. And that simple printing mistake transforms the story completely. The inverted center variety is extraordinarily rare. One documented census cited by auction records counted only 89 used examples of the perforated 24-cent invert, including just a handful of unused examples. Now listen to the numbers. A rare example of the inverted center variety was sold by Robert Siegel Auction Galleries for $40,000. Another, particularly desirable example sold for $42,500. Other examples have sold for thousands of dollars even when they had faults or repairs. One auction listing even notes a Scott value of $37,500 for a finely centered example of the inverted center variety. That means the difference between a normal example and a rare printing variety can be enormous. A stamp that might sell for hundreds of dollars in ordinary used condition can potentially become a five-figure collectible when it possesses a major recognized error, and that is why collectors should never judge an old stamp purely by appearance. The real value can be hiding in the details. Is the center inverted? Is the stamp genuinely original? Is the gum intact? Are the perforations genuine? Has the stamp been repaired or regummed? How strong are the colors? How good is the centering? Does it have a certificate from a respected expertising organization? The stamp shown here should therefore be treated as a fascinating historical collectible, but its exact value cannot be determined from a photograph alone. Condition and authentication are critical, especially when dealing with valuable 19th century stamps and major varieties. Think about the journey this tiny piece of paper may have taken. It was printed in 1869, handled by people living in another era, transported through a postal system powered by horses, trains, ships, and early industrial technology, and somehow survived more than a century and a half to end up in a collection today. Its original face value was 24 cents, but exceptional examples, and especially the rare inverted center variety, have demonstrated auction results reaching tens of thousands of dollars. That's the incredible world of old U.S. stamps. Sometimes the difference between an interesting antique and a major philatelic treasure is hidden in one tiny printing detail. Next up, we come to one of the most famous stamps in American philately. The stamp shown here is the 1918 24-cent Curtis Jenny. the famous American airmail stamp featuring the blue Curtiss airplane surrounded by a red frame. This particular stamp is incredibly important because it was part of America's first regular airmail issue. The U.S. Post Office Department authorized airmail service at a rate of 24 cents per ounce, and the Bureau of Engraving and Printing rushed this new stamp into production. Look at the design carefully. The red outer frame surrounds a blue airplane flying across the center. The stamp is printed in 2 colors, which created a major challenge for the printers because the frame and airplane had to be printed separately. The airplane itself was based on the Curtiss JN-4, popularly known as the Jenny, an aircraft used for early American airmail service. The normal stamp shown here is historically important on its own, but this particular stamp has a legendary story connected to it, one of the greatest stories in the entire world of stamp collecting. In 1918, a sheet of these new 24-cent airmail stamps was accidentally produced with the blue airplane printed upside down. Think about that for a moment. 1 sheet, 100 stamps, and the printing error escaped detection. The sheet was eventually purchased by William T. Roby for only $24, its face value. The error was discovered, and the sheet quickly became the subject of intense interest among collectors and dealers. Roby sold the sheet for $15,000, and it subsequently went to collector Colonel Edward H. R. Green. That $24 purchase would become one of the greatest stories in collecting history. The error is now known as the inverted Jenny, and this is where the value becomes almost unbelievable. The ordinary 24-cent Curtiss Jenny and the inverted Jenny should not be confused. The stamp in your image shows the airplane in the normal orientation, not upside down. So we should not call this particular stamp $1 million inverted Jenny. However, the same 1918 issue produced the famous error, and authenticated examples of that error have reached extraordinary prices. A single inverted Jenny has sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars, while a famous example sold for approximately $977,500. The story goes even further. Sotheby's has described the famous inverted Jenny plate block as one of the most valuable items in stamp collecting, with an estimated value of $5 million to $7 million in its catalog, and more recent market references place the top end of individual inverted Jenny examples around $2 million, depending heavily on condition, position, provenance, and certification. This is exactly why collectors examine every old 24-cent Jenny very carefully. The normal 1918 stamp can itself have collectible value, particularly when it has excellent centering, fresh original gum, exceptional color, plate number material, or interesting printing varieties. Auction records show ordinary examples and specialized varieties selling for hundreds or thousands of dollars, while exceptional varieties have brought considerably more. But if someone discovers a genuine inverted Jenny, the situation changes dramatically. The airplane would appear upside down inside the red frame. That is the feature collectors immediately look for. However, this is not something that should be judged casually from a photograph. A valuable error needs professional authentication, because the difference between an ordinary Jenny and a genuine inverted Jenny can represent an enormous amount of money, and that is what makes this stamp such a powerful story for any collector. Imagine purchasing a stamp for 24 cents in 1918 and discovering that a printing mistake had transformed it into one of the most recognizable rarities in American philately. The U.S. Postal Service was trying to launch a new era of transportation mail carried through the sky by airplanes. The stamp was created to celebrate that technological revolution. Yet a simple printing mistake turned the stamp itself into a piece of collecting history. More than a century later, the Curtiss Jenny remains one of the most famous images in American stamp collecting. So when you look at the 24-cent stamp shown here, don't just see an old airplane. See the beginning of American airmail. See the rise of aviation. See the incredible story of a printing error that created the inverted Jenny. And remember one important lesson from this stamp. Sometimes the difference between an ordinary collectible and a multi-million-dollar rarity is just one tiny detail.